At first, your yard still looks the same in the morning light, the same quiet fence line, the same branches holding still above a thin layer of early sunlight. But something about the space feels unfinished, like a sound you expected but never arrived. The feet are hanging slightly motionless, without the usual small interruptions of wings and hesitation. The air is light, but it carries a strange emptiness, not silence exactly, but a missing layer you can't immediately name. You stand near the window, coffee warm in your hand, and your eyes keep drifting to the maple tree where chickadees usually gather in quick, restless movements. Yet today, there is nothing, not even the faint flicker of motion between leaves. Cardinals, which usually arrive with that slow, deliberate confidence along the fence line, are absent too, leaving the structure of the yard visually intact but emotionally hollow. Even the crows, often distant but aware, seem to have withdrawn from their usual presence above the rooftops. It feels like the yard is waiting for something it already knows will not come. And if you are new here, you might consider subscribing before you leave, because what you are about to understand about this quiet shift will change the way you look at every backyard you have ever known. But in this moment, there is no explanation yet, only observation, only the subtle awareness that something in the pattern has changed without permission. And that is where the unease begins to settle in, quietly, like the air itself is holding its breath. Because what you are noticing is not just absence, but the beginning of a pattern you were never meant to overlook. It is strange how easily you convince yourself nothing has changed. One morning the yard feels empty, and by the next day your mind builds explanations that feel almost reasonable enough to accept. Maybe it is the weather, maybe the season shifting, maybe you simply missed the moment they came and left. You stand by the same window again, coffee still warm in your hand, telling yourself you are overthinking something that does not need attention. But you know that feeling when something familiar quietly stops feeling alive. It is not dramatic, it is subtle, almost invisible in the way it fades. The chickadees that once arrived in quick restless bursts around the feeder are no longer present in the same rhythm, their visits stretched without warning between longer silences. The cardinal that used to appear along the fence line at almost the same time each morning now feels less like certainty and more like something you are trying to remember correctly. Even the distant crows above the rooftops seem thinner in number, their presence reduced to brief passing shadows across the sky. And yet, life continues in its usual way around you. You still move through your morning routine, you still hear wind moving through the branches, you still see leaves shifting in familiar patterns. But there is a growing sense that something small and essential has quietly stepped out of alignment. Most people would never name it. Most people would dismiss it without a second thought. But you notice it anyway in the pauses, in the gaps between what used to be there and what remains. It is only after you start paying closer attention that you begin to notice the pattern was never sudden at all. It was gradual, almost polite in the way it unfolded, like something quietly stepping away so softly that you could not hear the movement until the space it occupied became noticeable. The chickadees, which once moved through the maple tree in quick and restless bursts, were the first to change their rhythm, not disappearing completely, but arriving with hesitation that did not exist before. Pausing longer, on distant branches, as if evaluating something you cannot see. The cardinals followed a different pattern, less frantic but more deliberate, no longer committing to the same predictable fence line perches, sometimes circling once before choosing not to land at all. Even the crows, which usually felt like a distant constant above the rooftops, began shifting their flight paths slightly farther away, as if the invisible boundaries of the yard had changed shape without warning. And what most people never realize is that birds rarely leave without first testing the environment in small and visible ways, adjusting distance, timing, and presence long before absence becomes obvious. It is not escape. It is assessment, a continuous reading of conditions that we are not trained to perceive. Something about your yard, or perhaps something around it, begins to register differently in their behavior, not as danger immediately, but as uncertainty. And uncertainty is often enough. The strange part is how easily the human mind explains it away. How quickly silence becomes normal, how absence becomes just another part of the day, until you are left wondering when exactly the shift began, and why you did not feel it happening while it was still small enough to understand. It is easy to assume that nothing in nature is paying attention to you, that the yard is simply a quiet space where birds come and go according to simple patterns of weather and instinct. But what researchers have observed over time tells a slightly more intricate story. In long-term field studies on common backyard species like chickadees and cardinals, what appears as disappearance is often preceded by a measurable shift in behavior, not random but structured, almost like a recalibration of distance and timing in response to environmental uncertainty. Chickadees in particular have been documented adjusting their approach patterns within seconds of detecting subtle changes in their surroundings, altering how close they land, how long they stay, and whether they vocalize at all. These are not conscious decisions in the human sense, but highly evolved survival responses shaped by memory and pattern recognition at a level that operates continuously in the background of their behavior. Even crows, with their well-documented facial recognition abilities, respond not just to direct threats but to changes in routine, remembering safe zones and unsafe zones over long periods of time and modifying their presence accordingly. What feels to us like silence is often, in their world, a shift in risk assessment that spreads quietly through a local population without sound or announcement. Studies from urban ornithology research groups, including long-term observation projects at institutions like the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, have shown that birds rely heavily on consistency in environment, feeder placement, and human activity patterns, and even small disruptions in those patterns can lead to gradual relocation over days or weeks. There is no single trigger, no dramatic event, only accumulation of small signals that we rarely notice but they register instantly. And once you begin to understand this, the absence in your yard stops feeling random and starts feeling like something structured, almost like a language you were never taught how to hear, but one that was always there, quietly shaping the rhythm of every return and every departure. There is a moment in the late morning when you find yourself standing closer to the window than you intended, not because you are looking for anything specific, but because your attention keeps returning there without effort, as if the space outside has become part of your internal rhythm. The feeder swings slightly in the light breeze, empty in a way that feels more noticeable now than before, and the branches of the maple tree hold still with an unusual kind of patience. You notice small details you would normally overlook, like the way the shadows move across the fence at a slower pace when nothing interrupts them, or the absence of those quick wing flashes that used to break the stillness every few seconds. At one point, you think you hear movement, a faint rustle near the edge of the yard, and your eyes instinctively shift toward it, expecting the familiar pattern of chickadees arriving in quick, uneven bursts. But there is only a single leaf drifting downward without urgency. Even the cardinal perch on the fence line remains empty, not dramatically, but in a way that feels like it has quietly decided to wait somewhere else. And strangely, instead of feeling entirely like loss, there is a growing awareness of how much these small presences used to mean to your daily sense of space, how their movements once filled gaps you never consciously noticed. It is in these subtle absences that something begins to form, not explanation, not certainty, but a quiet recognition that you are still connected to this place in a way that is deeper than observation, as if the yard and its missing visitors are still speaking to you in a language made of pauses and waiting. By the time the afternoon light begins to stretch across the yard, the absence no longer feels like something that simply happened in the morning. It starts to feel like something that is actively continuing, as if the space itself is being slowly redefined hour by hour. You notice the feeder still untouched, not just empty, but ignored in a way that feels intentional, as if the idea of returning to it has been quietly removed from consideration. The maple tree, which once carried constant motion, now holds a kind of structured stillness, where even the smallest flicker of movement feels absent rather than hidden. And what becomes even more noticeable is how the rest of the environment begins to compensate for that absence. The insects seem louder now, the wind across the grass more pronounced, the distant hum of the neighborhood more exposed without the soft interruption of wings and calls that used to break it apart into smaller, more familiar pieces. At one point, you step outside and realize that the silence is not uniform across space, because just beyond your yard, near the neighboring fence line, there are faint signs of life, brief bird movement, distant calls, almost like the pattern continues everywhere except here. That realization settles in slowly, not as fear, but as a kind of quiet widening of perspective, as if your yard has been subtly marked by a shift that others around it have not fully entered. Even the air feels slightly different when you stand still long, tadawan enough less occupied, more open, as if something that once defined its rhythm has withdrawn its presence entirely. And yet, What is most unsettling is not the emptiness itself, but the growing sense that this absence is not final, that it is still unfolding in ways you have not yet understood, because there is a detail you keep almost noticing, something small at the edge of perception, as if the yard is still trying to tell you when exactly everything truly changed, and why it did not start all at once. As the evening begins to settle over the yard, there is a shift in how the absence feels, no longer just something observable, but something that seems to carry meaning, as if it is pointing toward a layer of understanding that is not immediately visible. You stand near the same window again, watching the fading light touch the fence line, and it strikes you how many people who spend time observing nature eventually describe similar moments, moments where familiar patterns suddenly break without clear reason, and yet do not feel random at all. Many people believe that when consistent natural rhythms change in this way, it reflects something more than surface-level cause and effect, not in a dramatic or absolute sense, but in the quiet way systems respond to subtle shifts most of us do not consciously register. Something about this feels difficult to ignore when you are the one standing inside it. When the same yard that once felt alive with chickadees, cardinals, and distant crows now feels like it is holding a kind of unanswered question. The space does not feel empty in a simple way. It feels observant, as if it has recalibrated its relationship with presence itself. Even the wind through the branches seems to carry more clarity now, as if every small sound has been given room to exist without interruption. And in that widening quiet, you begin to notice how easily meaning can form inside absence, how the mind naturally searches for connection between events that unfold slowly over time, especially when the pattern involves living things that once felt familiar and constant. It is in this state that the question stops being only about what changed, and begins to feel like it might also be about what was understood all along but never fully recognized until everything became still enough to notice. By the time the night begins to settle completely over the yard, everything feels slower, as if even time itself has reduced its pace to match the stillness that has taken hold outside your window. You stand there without moving for longer than you realize, watching the faint outline of the fence fade into the darker tones of evening, and there is a quiet acceptance forming that does not feel like understanding, but something softer, something closer to recognition. The feeder hangs motionless, barely visible now, not because it has changed, but because nothing interacts with it anymore, as if its purpose has been gently paused. The maple tree, once filled with restless presence, now exists as a silhouette rather than a living structure, its branches no longer breaking the air with motion or sound. And in this stillness, there is a strange emotional clarity that begins to rise, not sharp or sudden, but gradual, like realizing a thought you have been circling for a long time without naming it. It is the awareness that absence itself can feel structured, almost meaningful, as if it carries its own form of communication that does not rely on sound or movement. You find yourself no longer searching for what changed, but instead sitting with the quiet realization that change itself has already completed its work, and what remains is simply the echo of what used to be. And in that moment, there is no urgency left, only a deep and lingering stillness that feels like it is holding space for something you are not yet meant to fully understand. Something that lingers just beyond explanation, but stays with you long after you stop looking for answers. By the time the night fully settles, there is nothing left in the yard that asks for your attention, and yet you still find yourself looking out, not searching for what was lost, but trying to understand what remains. The feeder hangs in the dark like a memory of movement rather than an object, and the fence line has become a simple outline against the deeper shadow of the trees. At some point, you realize you are no longer expecting sudden wings or quick shifts in the branches, and that realization does not feel like disappointment anymore, but something quieter, almost like acceptance forming slowly inside you without effort. It is in this stillness that you begin to understand how easily presence becomes part of a place, and how its absence does not erase the place itself, only changes the way it speaks back to you. If you are still here, listening to this moment unfold, you are part of this reflection now, and if you find meaning in these quiet observations, you might consider subscribing before you leave, because there are still many places like this where the world changes in ways most people never pause long enough to notice. And after everything that has unfolded, there is no final explanation that arrives, only a softer understanding that some patterns are not meant to be solved, but witnessed. You stand for a moment longer, letting the night air settle around the edges of thought. And somewhere in that silence it feels as if the yard is still communicating, just not in the way you once expected. And as you finally turn away from the window, there is a lingering sense that nothing here has truly ended. It has only shifted into a form that is harder to see, because some absences do not disappear, they simply continue existing just beyond what you are able to hear. And maybe it was only birds leaving a yard, but it never felt like only that. And even now, somewhere out there beyond the edge of the night, it feels like something is still remembering the place you stood.